Hello again, I'm Tripp Rogers, and this is Tripp's Take. I want to share a couple of things about the election. And one of the things is you hear the people who were vocal in their support for the vice president say, well, America wasn't ready for a woman president. Well, I think that's malarkey. I think the United States is ready for a woman president. I think the problem is the Democrats have run two candidates that people did not like. I think Hillary Clinton had a lot of baggage, and I think the vice president this time around had baggage. And the biggest problem or the biggest baggage she had was the fact that she didn't go through a primary. She was appointed to be the presidential candidate. And that's because Joe Biden put the Democratic Party in somewhat of a bind when he decided not to only go for one term, as he had said he was going to do. But the second thing, and this is what most of Tripp's Take today is going to be about, if you've ever watched the show For All Mankind, it deals with an alternate reality or an alternate universe. And instead of the United States winning the space race, what if the Russians had been first on the moon? And what would have happened? Would we have stopped exploring space as we did in 1972? Or would we have continued? And so that's the basis of this series. And it's really fascinating because you have the Russians, you have the Americans, you also have Korea involved. And it talks, and the show has jumped around. Basically, you have moon bases, and then you have exploration of Mars, and you have a private company involved, and now they're mining some type of chemical that is only found on Mars that can help the Earth and that kind of thing. And they also dealt with an orbiting hotel, space hotel. There's a lot of different things on this show, and it is very fascinating. It's coming back on Apple TV Plus at some point in the next couple of months. But I want to go to this alternate universe type of thing. What if Joe Biden had stuck to his plans and said, I'm not running for president in 2024? What if the Democrats had a candidate that was selected through the nomination process? Now, it still could have been the vice president. And if it was the vice president, I think she would have won, because I think that a lot of people did not like the idea that she was appointed and she never faced a primary. In fact, remember, she had gotten out before Iowa in 2020. So she never really had been tested in primary season. That's a woulda, coulda, shoulda for this election. But I want to go back, and I'm going to go back into the 60s when I grew up. First off, what if John F. Kennedy wasn't assassinated? Would he have won re-election? Now, at the time, Kennedy was he was still very popular, although Jackie was probably more popular than the president. But I think he probably would have won re-election because of the fact that he was the incumbent, and I don't think the Republicans really had anybody to run. But, all right, let's take that off the table. LBJ became the president, and he won his first full term in 1964. So what if LBJ ran in 1968 as opposed to Hubert Humphrey? Well, Johnson was already having issues with the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was not popular, especially among young Americans. But how would he have done against Richard Nixon? Well, again, I don't know if LBJ could have won that second term, but I don't know if Richard Nixon would have won either. But hey, let's throw that scenario out. Remember, the reason why LBJ didn't run is because Bobby Kennedy was considering a run, and at the time LBJ pulled out, Bobby Kennedy jumped into the presidential primary season at that point. What if Bobby Kennedy had not been killed and not been assassinated? Well, I don't see, I will say this, having grown up at that time, I don't see any way Nixon would have won the presidency against Bobby Kennedy. I just don't think it would have happened. I mean, Bobby Kennedy was very popular. He was the brother of the slain president. I think he would have won. So you kind of wonder, would we ever have had Watergate? Just saying, because there's no Nixon. Because Nixon, I don't think, Nixon would have then lost 2 elections to 2 different Kennedys, and he would not have run. But so let's move on now. What would have happened in 1976? Here's a woulda, coulda, shoulda. Would Ted Kennedy have run? Well, Chappaquiddick happened in 1969, and that was a reunion of the folks who were working for Bobby Kennedy's campaign. Of course, they had gotten together for a weekend approximately a little over a year after he had passed away. So you wouldn't have that Chappaquiddick. You kind of wonder, would Ted Kennedy have been the guy to run in 1976? His presidential campaign in 1980, while it took him all the way to the convention, did not work out for him. Jimmy Carter, of course, won the nomination. Ted Kennedy was haunted by Chappaquiddick, and that really is kind of what did him in that presidential campaign. But again, you kind of wonder, could the Kennedys have run the family business and kept going into the 1980s? Let's go with this one. What would have happened if in 1996 Bill Clinton had admitted, or they found out about Monica Lewinsky? Remember, one of the problems that Bill Clinton had in his second term was he admitted there was something going on with Monica Lewinsky. And a lot of people were very upset about that. Had Clinton come clean earlier, he may not have won re-election, but if he won re-election, I think it would have been easier for Al Gore to win in 2000. See, the problem was Al Gore was trying to succeed Bill Clinton. And again, a Bill Clinton that people were upset with because of the Monica Lewinsky affair. George W. Bush won the presidency that year, and you remember the hanging chads and all of this. It was a very, very close election. I think one of the reasons he won is because people were upset with the Democrats. Which leads me to, I've said this a number of times on Tripp's Take, and I want to bring it back to 2024. My buddy Dolph is a political analyst. I mean, he studies politics. He's on the inside of the West Virginia GOP. And he said to me, he said this a while ago, America's voting electorate is made up of 40% Republican, 40% Democrat, and then there's 20% that will swing. In 2016, that 20% went with Donald Trump. In 2020, that 20% went with Joe Biden. In 2024, that swing 20% went with Donald Trump. So again, essentially the election is really for 20% of the voting public. Because again, you have, 40% Republican who will always vote Republican, 40% Democrat who will always vote Democrat. And that 20% will swing back and forth between Republican and Democrat. And the other thing also is, I think, and I mentioned this last week, one of the reasons people vote the way they do is they vote their pocketbook in October of the election year. In October 2016, people voted for Trump because they felt he had better economic ideas. Hillary Clinton would continue the policies of Barack Obama. And remember, Obama was the president when we had a huge crash in 2009. And Barack Obama's presidency, I've never thought was a great presidency. But I will say in the years since his term, his stature as a statesman has grown. And I think that's something that makes someone's presidency grow in stature too. A lot of people say it was a good presidency. I disagree. But people voted their pocketbooks in 2016. In 2020, and I even said it in 2017, people are going to vote their pocketbooks. In October 2020, well, your pocketbook was a little better. There's only one problem. We had COVID. People were scared to leave their houses. And Donald Trump did not seem to address the problem. And I think that was a huge issue on voters' minds. And I think that's why Donald Trump was voted out in 2020. In 2024, let's face it, the economy has really taken a hit. And people, and I've heard this from a number of people who I've talked to, you can't afford another 4 years like we've just had. People voted their pocketbook and voted for Donald Trump. Now, what's going to happen in 2028? Well, I'm going to say the same thing. And we haven't even finished this. We just finished this election. But again, I'm going to go with people are going to vote their pocketbook in October of 2028. If the economy is not doing well, as Donald Trump says he's going to do with the economy, then the Republicans have little chance of holding on to the White House, and it will flip back to the Democrats. Not because the Democrats will offer a economic plan that will help. It's because people will vote their pocketbooks. If they aren't happy, they will vote the other party. It's that 20% that keeps flipping back and forth. One thing I think that bears noting, I think, and I say this for Georgia, 50% of Georgia's registered voters voted early in this election. 50%. That's a staggering figure. Now, I think it was 41% were early voting, because they have early voting a couple of weeks before here in Georgia. And I early voting is great. I got to tell you, it is wonderful. But I'll flip it around. If you recall, on election night, they had issues with the chips that were used, the memory chips were used in the machines, and that delayed the count in Georgia. So I think it's kind of funny, but you had so many people voting. I think that was a really good thing. And I didn't realize they had started early voting in New Jersey, but I think early voting is great, because to limit it to one day is very difficult, because people have to make plans. And if you're working, it's usually a working day. You have to then make plans to vote either early or late. I think the best piece of advice I gave Sandy was to go to the polls and vote when they first open at 7 o'clock in the morning. As I said, there aren't going to be that many people there. And she said, you were right. There was nobody there, in and out in 10 minutes. I said, that's the way to go. That is Tripp's Take for November the 14th, 2024. I'd love to hear your comments and questions about my podcast. Just feel free to email trippstake@gmail.com. Fantasy football players, the Hall of Famer Mike Scheck and yours truly will get you ready for Week 11 in the NFL season with the Fantasy Sultans. You can find that podcast the same places you find Tripp's Take, on Spotify for podcasters, YouTube. Just search for the Fantasy Sultans. If you like the music of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, give a listen to WTRSradio.com online. For now, I'm Tripp Rogers. Thank you so much for joining me. Make it a great one.